Software licensing is always going to be a bit of a touchy subject in the FOSS world. It's kind of the foundation of the whole thing, free and open source software. And recently, a big discussion was set off by Thorsten Lehm, who's of the Linux kernel, in regards to a relatively small, but well-known enough name in this space, Tuxedo Computers, a German computer retailer specializing in Linux machines. Also, they do the whole core boot thing as well. Now, whether they're a good company or a bad company, you like their products, you like their pricing, all that stuff, not really relevant to what we're talking about today. Just know they are our focus. Now, this is the post that started everything. Today, I learned Tuxedo Computers released Linux kernel drivers for their machines under the GPL v3, which makes it impossible for competitors and distros to ship them pre-compiled, as that license is incompatible with the Linux kernel's GPL v2 only license. They did this purposely, allegedly, to keep control of the upstream pacing and want to relicense the code while upstreaming. You can't really say purposely, allegedly. Like, that's not a sentence structure that makes any sense. Also, this is a direct quote from the repo, so I wouldn't say it's allegedly when it's from someone high up in the company. Now, the screenshot he included just isn't very useful. I don't know why this is the one he included, but at least he did include some links, making it a lot easier for me to go and get started. I don't know how this always happens. I really wish I did, but 4 years ago, an issue was made by Neil Gompa, licensing incompatibility between Linux kernel and these kernel modules in regards to drivers made by Tuxedo. I was looking into this project's kernel modules to figure out packaging it, and I discovered this project's license is not compatible with the Linux kernel's own license, thus the combination is not redistributable. The Linux kernel is GPL v2, and the kernel modules are GPL v3+, GPL v3 or later. As GPL v3 is incompatible with the GPL v2, when the combination of software cannot be upgraded to GPL v3 on redistribution, as is the case with the Linux kernel, which is GPL v2 only, shipping this or getting this merged into the mainline kernel will not be possible without fixing the licensing of these modules first. Please, can you relicense the modules to GPL v2+, GPL v2 or later to make it compatible with the Linux kernel? I suspect this was an unintentional incompatibility, and I hope this can be swiftly resolved. On the surface, that seems like a completely reasonable ask. Like System76, Tuxedo does have their own distro, that being Tuxedo OS, and when you buy a Tuxedo system, these modules are pre-installed, and you don't have to think about them. That's until you want to go and install a distro that isn't Tuxedo, and then you have to go and add these additional modules, and it's just a giant hassle. No one wants to do that, and if you're an NVIDIA user, you know all about this pain. Going to a distro that doesn't pre-install the NVIDIA drivers for you, and you have to go and work it out for yourself, that's annoying. Nobody wants that. But the problem is not exactly that simple. Now, the idea of merging these drivers into upstream didn't actually come from that post. It came from an earlier issue in 2019, just called Upstreaming. What's the current status of merging this into the Linux kernel? Then, a year later, any updates, and nothing else. Then they moved over to GitLab, and that's the last post. Now, the first issue we saw from Neil did lead to something being done, a merge request being made, relicensing from GPL v3 to GPL v2 or later. But what's the deal with the whole GPL v3 or GPL v2 or later? Why can't you just go and take the GPL v3 code and then use it with the GPL v2 kernel? Well, you can. If you're not distributing it and you're just using it on your personal system, there's not really an issue. The issue is with distribution. In the GPL v2, there is this clause here. Each time you redistribute the program or any work based on the program, the recipient automatically receives a license from the original licenser to copy, distribute, or modify the program subject to these terms and conditions. You may not impose any further restrictions on the recipient's exercise of the rights granted herein. You are not responsible for enforcing compliance by third parties to this license. The part we care about is this. You may not impose any further restrictions on the recipient's exercise of the rights granted herein. What does that mean? Well, if you have a license that is more restrictive than the GPL v2, as in it is restricting some of the rights granted by the GPL v2, that is not compatible. And restricting certain rights is the whole reason the GPL v3 exists. Now, you might frame it as protecting users' rights, but, it is what it is. At the core of it, it is restricting certain rights by stopping a concept known as TiVoization, where what people were doing, what specifically TiVo was doing, was taking GPL software and running it on this box, where if you modified the software through DRM measures, the box would no longer function. So whilst you could modify the software, whilst you could see the source code, if you tried to actually use modified software, you wouldn't be able to do so. And Linus never cared about TiVoization. He never considered this a problem. In fact, he doesn't even like the term TiVoization and looks at the concept as sort of a positive thing. And this is the reason why he likes the GPL v2. This is a positive trait of the license and why Linux was never relicensed as the GPL v3. Now, whilst they could go and say, I'm going to take the drivers and go from GPL v3 to GPL v2, that creates the same problem just for different people. Now the drivers would be compatible with the Linux kernel, but if there are people using the GPL v3 drivers in a GPL v3 compatible way, and now you go to GPL v2, now they have problems. The solution to this is GPL v2 or later. What this means is effectively it can either be used as GPL v2 code or GPL v3 code, depending on who wants to go and use the code. If you want to look at it in another sense, it's basically dual licensing the code, but not just dual licensing the code, also licensing it in a GPL v4, GPL v5, or anything else that might happen in the future. Now the problem is, whilst PR was made 4 years ago, it kind of just sat around with not much happening. There were some external contributors they did need to ask. Luckily, they didn't have many of them, and each of them said, okay, yeah, I'm totally fine with doing this. Go ahead and do so. Everybody signed off. So all of the external contributors and the company signed off on this happening. It just didn't happen, and it just sat around for 4 years. 3 years until moving over to the GitLab, and then a new issue being made over there. Now, this is the issue we originally saw being screenshotted, relicensed to GPL v2 or later, made by Salim B. And here we had the first comment from Werner Sembach, and rather than saying, okay, we should probably go ahead and do this, it was a different answer. We plan on upstreaming a first module of Tuxedo drivers, see here, which then will automatically get relicensed to GPL v2 upon sending it to the LKML. We do not plan to relicense Tuxedo drivers project directly, as we want to keep control of the upstream pacing. Therefore, this thread will be closed. I hope you understand. So rather than taking the entire project and relicensing it, going ahead and only relicensing the parts that they are sending up to upstream to make sure it's compatible then, which, at least to me, seems like a lot of additional work to not really get much benefit. They say to control the pacing, so I guess the issue is they don't want people taking the driver and then trying to upstream it before it's ready. But I don't know who's actually going to go ahead and do that, because if it's not ready, then it's not going to get merged anyway. And why would they be accepting Tuxedo driver code from people that aren't related to the Tuxedo project? And if you see that happening, you can say, hey, this is not ready, what are you doing here? And that person will get blacklisted from the mailing list. And there's not many people who are going to try to go ahead and do that. So it seems like a really weird approach to take. It's not necessarily, like, bad. You're allowed to do this. It's just weird. Normally, relicensing the code like this would be basically impossible, but because most of the code is written by internal developers and the external contributors they have already signed off on doing so, you could do it, right? Like, it's doable. And I guess in a sense, it's kind of like NVIDIA's open source kernel modules where the development isn't done in an open source way. The development, for the most part, with the exception of like minor documentation changes, is done proprietary at NVIDIA. And then when they have a release ready, then they go and release the rest of it open source. This isn't as extreme as that, but I guess it's kinda similar? Now, there's more than one similarity with NVIDIA. Neil points out, this means you have a non-redistributable combination, GPL v3 or later, cannot be combined with GPL v2 only code, the license of Linux. No. With the sending this code up to upstream, we automatically agree to relicensing it to GPL v2. As soon as we send code containing contributor contributions, we of course have to ask first, but this is not the case for the serious driver code. Legally, this is decided on a per line of code basis and not for the whole project. Yes, but this is not redistributable as is, which I presume is what you're shipping on Tuxedo computers. Now I guess I know what you mean. The situation is, since Tuxedo Drivers is an out-of-tree DKMS package, it is not distributed as part of the Linux kernel code, but dynamically loaded as separate binaries. Therefore, no source code licensing compatibility is required. Also, on Tuxedo OS, we install it as a DKMS package and have not merged it into the Tuxedo kernel code. For a more prominent example, it's the same way the proprietary NVIDIA driver is distributed, which of course has no code licensing compatibility to the Linux kernel whatsoever. And that comparison is going to come back to bite them. Now, in the past, they have attempted to get certain pieces of Tuxedo drivers upstreamed into the kernel, as we can see through this LKML post here. But after that attempt was made, it was then tagged as low priority, heavy weight. And 2 months ago, a section was added to the README regarding upstreaming. The code, while perfectly functional, is not currently in an upstreamable state. That being said, we started an upstreaming effort for the first small part of the keyboard backlight control for the Series 16 Gen 1 and Gen 2, which will be followed by more once it is accepted. If you want to hack away at this yourself, please follow the following precautions and guidelines to avoid breakages on both software and hardware level. Involve us in the whole process. We mostly can't share documentation, but we can share answers. Code interacting with the EC, which is most of Tuxedo drivers, can break devices and therefore must be ensured to only run on compatible and tested devices. And if you use Tuxedo driver as a reference or code snippets from it, a code developed by that person at Tuxedo Computers must be included in your upstream commit. And following that addition being made, this issue was closed for now. Now, everything we've talked about so far happened before Thorsten brought this to anyone's attention. This is the past 4 years of backstory to get here. Following this happening, a very weird issue was discovered. Add SPDX license identifiers and be honest in module license. SPDX is just a standard way of saying what license a project is using. According to the Linux kernel docs, GPL as a parameter to module license means the module is licensed under GPL version 2. This is not true for this source code, which is GPL v3 or later, so mark the code with the SPDX license identifier GPL v3+, and fix the module license macro usages accordingly. Note that this change enforces license compliance at least a bit, because some kernel code is only available to modules with a GPL v2 compatible license. And this is where the problems started to happen. So effectively, what has been happening is the Tuxedo drivers have been, I guess, masquerading as GPL v2 code. They are GPL v3 code, but they said they were GPL v2. And this allowed them to do things in the kernel that only GPL v2 compatible code is allowed to do. Now, I've had a number of disagreements about this. I don't think they are being malicious here. I think this is a matter of incompetence. I don't think they realized what they were doing and kind of just left it as it is. And what further adds to this fact is the response from Werner. Thanks for the hint. Since GPL v3 is not a valid define according to the list and module license is optional, I will just remove the macro for the time being and see if anything breaks. Oh, it's not optional. Had to be reopened. Can you rebase this patch on the current main? Updated accordingly. I aligned all the module license strings to be equal. I had GPL3 plus once, and otherwise GPL-v3, now using the latter consistently. Some of the drive-by cleanups dropped as these were applied separately in main. Now, this does say merged. However, that is not entirely accurate, because very shortly after, it got reverted. Revert, add SPDX license identifiers, and be honest in module license. Revert for the time being until the legal stuff is sorted out. By legal stuff, what he actually means is, if you make this change, the driver no longer works, because it's been masquerading as GPL-v2 code, and it kinda relies on being GPL-v2 code compatible. With Thorsten saying it best, wondering why that happened. Did they only notice now that the drivers do not compile anymore because they use GPL-only symbols which are inaccessible for any non-GPL-v2 compatible module? Now, we have a bit of a problem, because the person who made this merger isn't just some random drive-by contributor. They have a history of contributing to the Linux kernel, and they want to make sure the problem gets resolved. So they went and did the next best thing, or you might even argue, the better thing. Put known GPL offenders in an array. Hello. The kernel modules provided by Tuxedo onto their driver repo are licensed under GPL-v3 or later. This is incompatible with the kernel's license, and so makes it impossible for distributions and other third parties to support these at least in precompiled form, and so limits user experience and the possibility to work on mainlining these drivers. This incompatibility is created on purpose to control the upstream process, as documented by Thorsten. Note that the pull request that fixed the module license invocations to stop claiming GPL-v2 compatibility was accepted and then immediately reverted for the time being until the legal stuff is sorted out. And then the second part of the patch set basically tells the module loader effectively to blacklist these modules from the GPL-v2 part of the project because they're not being honest about being GPL-v2, so I guess we've got to fix it upstream alongside some known other offenders, but the majority of the list is from Tuxedo. There's also one here for, actually, there's two here from Clevo. Now, for Tuxedo, I think this may have blown up a bit more than they had expected, and they didn't really think they'd have to fix this as quickly as they needed to. So, Werner also responded as well. As already being implied by that commit message, this is sadly not an issue that can be sorted out overnight. We ended up in this situation as module license GPL on its own does not hint at GPL-v2 if one is not aware of the license definition table in the documentation. It was and is never our intention to violate neither GPL-v2 nor GPL-v3, and we are working on it. Kind regards, Werner Sembach. Now, before you do anything involving macros and functions and all that stuff, I would highly recommend reading the documentation. Again, this sort of links back into my theory that this is incompetence and not malice. To which Greg Crower-Hartman responded, "That's why it is documented, to explain this very thing. Please don't suggest that documenting this is somehow not providing a hint. That's not going to fly with any lawyer who reads any of this. Sorry, Greg KH." I love the way he signs off every single message. Like, I don't know what it is. It just feels like he just is sick of everyone every time he signs off a message, which probably isn't too far from the truth. Now, Werner tried to explain the situation. Yes, we know this is a problem. I'm a developer, not a lawyer. Didn't realize this was a problem until a couple of days ago. We're working on this. People are calling us a liar and saying that, like, we're trying to do this maliciously. And can you just give us a time frame to resolve the license issue before this is merged? Before this change is merged, that if they updated their kernel, they'd have to go and ship a modified kernel to go and make this work on Tuxedo OS, but anyone on any other distro would have their Tuxedo computer basically just not work anymore. And Greg basically didn't want to engage. I would strongly suggest you work with your lawyers now, as they are the ones that need to resolve this properly. Thanks, Greg KH. Now, Werner kept trying to do it like, hey, yeah, we know it's a problem. Yeah, can we get, like, some time frame? Is it going to land in the next kernel version? Like, when is this going to become a problem that we need to deal with yesterday? this led to a fairly big discussion that you can go and check out for yourself, but the important thing is this led to a very, very sudden change. Relicense all in-house code to GPL v2 or later. Turns out that bricking all of your customers' computers, might be a way to get it fixed overnight. Now, normally the Linux kernel wouldn't go out of their way to, break user systems and break things they're doing. But, like, when legal issues are involved, when licensing issues are here, and it seems like a license has been violated for over 4 years, probably even longer than that, they're gonna have to deal with it basically immediately. This is a very different situation than, it removes some Wi-Fi card that someone happened to be using. No. That's not what we're talking about here. This is much worse than that. And I want to make it clear, I don't think at all they were malicious in this situation. I think for all of this time, they had no idea there was a problem. And yes, they were informed that there could have been a problem 4 years ago by someone who is also not a lawyer. So if the not a lawyer is talking to the not a lawyer, I get why you don't realize there is a problem here. Now, should he have talked to his lawyers? Should they have talked to their lawyers and got all this stuff resolved? 100%, this never should have been a problem, but I don't think this was malicious. I do genuinely think it was just a case of incompetence. But what do you think? Do you think it was malice? Do you think it was incompetence? Do you have a Tuxedo system? I would love to know. So if you like the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe to the Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and what do you run? Tell me.